weight because I get to record this, and then I look at it, I'm like, man, I look 20 pounds heavier on TV.
You look at.
Shouldn't I eat that seminar? That's what I say. It's tomorrow.
You just need to start choosing a slideshow presentation. That way you can go through your slides instead of watching them.
Yeah, that's true. We're ready to hone my video editing skills. Okay. So if any of you lacks wisdom, this is just a general conditional statement. If sometimes you have these if statements that imply a yes or a no answer, that there aren't any or there are some. This is just general. If any of you lacks wisdom, you may or may not. But if you do, then you should ask God. Now, what kind of wisdom is this? Now, when we first talked about this in our introduction, I said I think it's a general just wisdom about anything in particular. I think it does apply that way because there are these generalizing terms here, this if anyone lacks wisdom. But I think we do have warrant to read this in context of the first, or verses 2 through 4. He's talking here about knowledge. There's a lot of language here in chapter 1 about knowledge, about cognitive knowing. There's several different verbs and nouns that James uses here. So I think that it is safe to say that one of the important things that James insists that we begin with is a proper understanding of life, a proper understanding of reality as a Christian. We need to understand what life is in relationship to God. Now, we talked a lot about that when we were in Deuteronomy, and we called that reality covenant, right? This being in relationship with God, and how that covenant relationship molds and shapes and defines a person's and a community's reality. So here he had said in verse 2 that we are to consider, that's the first, or count, that's that first knowledge word. Count it all joy when you meet various trials. And then here's the second one, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So the first thing he does is very counterintuitive, I don't want to say cultural because it's broader than cultural, counter-cosmic maybe, counter-worldly. This idea that when you encounter sufferings, you should understand that encounter as an opportunity to produce in you a pure and undefiled joy, because you see it in light of a bigger picture of what God is doing. Using that trial to shape you, using that trial to produce in you, to test your faith, to refine your faith, and to make you and your faith perfect and complete. That's this vision of reality that James is setting out. And so this is difficult for us to get. If someone lacks this ability to see the world and their life and their circumstances and their situations in light of this reality, then they should ask God to give them wisdom to see that. And God, he says, let him ask God who gives generously. Now notice, he does not say, first of all, that let him ask God and it will be given to him. He says, let him ask God who gives generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. He throws in this phrase that is an identifier of who God is, of God's nature and character. And there's three parts to this. So I want to talk about each one of these three. So you could just cut it out. I mean, and I guess it would make sense. Let him ask of God, and it will be given to him. But James, again, his point here, it's difficult for us to come to terms with or to grasp because it is very counterintuitive here. He wants to make it very clear that his whole argument here for the book is grounded in two things: God's nature, God's character, and our disposition towards reality in light of God's character. Okay? So let him ask of God and it will be given to him. But the God who gives is the God who gives. Okay, that's number one. Number two. Okay, what's the phrase say? Let him ask God who gives generously. And number three, without reproach. Okay? Let him ask of the God who gives, the God who is like this, who gives. Now, number one, this is a pretty important theological principle throughout the Bible. Okay? If you miss this character of God, then I fear that you miss God. That you don't understand the God whom you serve, the God whom you worship. Because God is a fundamentally characteristically giving God. How am I trying to say that? Giving God. This reminds me of Hebrews 11:6. Do you know what Hebrews 11:6 says? For without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would come to him must believe that he is, and he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Yeah. So according to Hebrews, that's what faith is. You have to believe he is, you have to believe he rewards. That God not only exists, but that he gives. That he is able, and that he is willing. Okay? We approach, in Hebrews 4, he talks about we approach the throne of grace, right? So that we may receive. That we may receive. And how do we receive? It's because we approach a throne of grace, a God who sits upon this throne, characterized by grace, a God who gives. Okay? We see when God calls Abram, he says, "Fear not, Abram." And some translations say, "For your reward is great." I think it's the NIV that says, "For I am your exceedingly great reward," which I think I like better there. But God is fundamentally a giving God. He first gives existence, and he gives life. I think that we ought to think, as a matter of fact, of God as the giving God, we ought to think of creation itself as an act of giving. Why did God create? Was there some deficiency in God that required him to make anything? Did creating the worlds somehow fill up a void that God felt within himself that he needed to remedy? Why did God create? You ever thought about that?
I would say it was for us, not for him,
But we weren't in existence at the time.
So it's like,
Right?
Brings him glory.
Brings him glory. Wasn't he glorious before creation?
He's fundamentally creative, so he enjoys creating, I
Yeah.
think. So
I think so.
I think it's a picture of his character.
Yeah, it's part of his character.
It's weird to think about how you can create a being that could independently experience the relationship that he had in eternity, but still be connected in a way, but also independently experience what it was like to know things and understand things, and to have relationship with each other.
Didn't he already experience that kind of relationship in the Trinity eternally?
So if we were to dumb this down to human terms a little bit, which we might lose the analogy, but artists, people like that, we create, use that creative gift that God has given us as an expression of things that are given to us, right? And so tapping into the glory question, right? There's a reference to that. All of creation is filled with His glory, so what God accused, what that's really saying is that He has expressed His glory in His creation. And so a lot of what I think you're seeing in creation is really the expression of maybe God's attributes and characteristics in ways that He's making Himself known to us. You see some of that in the catchy one-liners in the Proverbs where it says, look at this, and look at this, and look at this. Or you see that in the Sermon on the Mount where He's like, you're concerned about this, but look how I've already taken care of, the lilies of the field or sparrows and things like that. And so I think that there is definitely an element of that expression throughout creation, because He's making us who He knows we're not going to be capable of fathoming and understanding these things. That's exactly what He tells us in Job, right? And then He gives us creation, just like He does in Job, to say, look at all that I've got going on. Humble yourself and submit.
Yeah. So, I think you guys are hitting it there, that God did not create because there was any need in Himself. There was no void in God that He needed to fill. God created because He is fundamentally creative. It is the nature of existence to breed existence, if you will. When God says, I am, what does that mean? He is the one who is. He is isness. Can you make is an abstract noun? Isness.
A lot of people have done a lot of things with is.
They use what is it? Usually you use Latin when you want to get to this quiddity, I think is what C.S. Lewis called it. But God is the one who is. He is existence. He doesn't draw His existence from anybody. He's not dependent on anything. He just is, and existence exists within Him, if we can talk in circles. And it's the nature of existence to exude existence. Jonathan Edwards, I think, said it perhaps the best, for me anyway. He said, it is no argument for the deficiency of a fountain that it is inclined or disposed to overflow. Okay? It is no argument for the deficiency of a fountain that it is inclined to overflow. You see a fountain overflowing with water and you say, oh, that fountain must be broken. No. The fountain doesn't need anything. It's overflowing because it's a fountain. And that's the metaphor he used to describe God and why God created the worlds. God didn't need anything. It's just, it flows out of Him. It is His nature. Because He is love, because He is kindness, because He is good, He didn't need an object to pour those things out on. But He creates them because that's who He is. More expressions of goodness and kindness and love. And so what this means, I think, is that when James says, let him ask God, who gives generously, this is a defining characteristic of God for James. One of the fundamental characteristics of God. We'll see it again in chapter 1, in verse 20 and 21, I believe it is, when he speaks about, not 20 and 21, verse 17, that every good and perfect gift comes from above, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of change. God's nature is fundamentally a giving nature. And this has to occupy your knowledge. This has to be part of what you know if you are to come to God and pray for wisdom. That wisdom to see the world as you ought to see it. as James is challenging you to see it. The way of seeing the world that says this trial, this temptation, this difficulty is actually an opportunity for joy, because God is not fundamentally a taking God. He is fundamentally a giving God, a gracious God, a benevolent and loving and kind and good God. So that's the first thing. The second thing is he gives generously. Now this is the second and third thing here are how God gives. So again, the number one is definitely number one, both in priority and in sequence. But these are going to describe how God gives. There's a way to give, which you can give a little bit, but you're going to skimp on the top, or off the bottom. Or you're going to find a way to give the least amount that you can, or maybe find that lowest amount and then give 10%. But you're gonna figure out, you're gonna do some calculations in your giving. God gives generously. He's not calculating how little he can give you so that you can just get by. He enjoys giving. This word haplos, it is a word that means singleness. We've talked about this. It's the word that means singleness, and by extension, it means that it is generous. It's again like one of these words that we've talked about, that it does not mean the same thing as undivided, but it does. It's a word that's connected. It's a word that is related to a word that means one, okay? That means without division, that means singleness. Okay? So there's this echo going on here that is talking about the character of God. I think we do hear just a hint of the Shema in this way that God gives. That God is one, and so you are to love the Lord your God as one, not a divided person, but loving him as one, heart, soul, and might. The way God gives to you is singly, generously, without divided loyalties, and the third one, without reproach. He's not looking for ways to take back a little bit of what he's given you. He's not, he doesn't have one hand held out offering and another hand hiding behind the back or waiting to smack you upside the head. He doesn't have ulterior motives in why he's given. He's not searching your history, your credit, your bank account, your track record. He gives simply, generously, to all, without reproach. To all whom, I should say. He gives generously to all, without reproach. All whom? Does he give to everybody? To whom does God give this way?
To his children, and to those that know him, belong to him.
Is that your bag? We will be sure that you have it. Okay, I'm glad you saw it.
If God gives to everybody generously and without reproach, then why do we need to ask? I think what he's doing here, this all is a general. It is generally. God does give to all, everybody. The good and the bad. The righteous and the wicked. He does give to everyone generously and without reproach. Okay. But notice it does not say God gives everything to everyone. In other words, the way that God gives generously and without reproach, if he gives something, that's how he gives it. So what does the scripture say about the rain?
Falls on the just and
It falls on the just and the unjust. What about the sun? It rises on the just and the unjust. What about life itself? He gives generously without reproach. God gives these. All these are good gifts. Every, as James says, every good and perfect gift is from above. The righteous and the wicked get good and perfect gifts. They're just associated with life itself. Now, this is part of what qualifies James as wisdom literature. If you read through the Proverbs and other sections of wisdom, you will see that this is this emphasis of creation and how just being part of creation itself entails receiving and enjoying blessings from God, whether you are righteous or wicked. Wisdom is found in how you relate to that, how you respond to those gifts that you have received. Wisdom and folly are bound up in your attitude toward the God who has given those things. Okay? And so what he's doing here, he says, this is a God who does give to all. He gives to all when he gives. That's God's character. But when you are looking for something specific, when you are looking to come to God and request him to give you something, then there are qualifications. It does not say, let him ask of God who gives to all everything. Or let him ask of God who gives all. He does not give everything. He is not bound and required to give you wisdom, for example. If wisdom is a way of life, a way of seeing and understanding and comprehending life and existence as it is in relationship to God, that is very counter to the way the world sees existence, then it makes sense that this is something that you can only get from God. It is something that God himself has to give. He has to give you wisdom. You have to go to him to get it. But here's the good news. If he gives you wisdom, he's going to give it generously. And he's going to give it without reproach. But that doesn't mean that he is required to give it. There are prerequisites. And James lists them here. The first one is, let him ask in faith, and let him ask with no doubting. Okay? Now let's look at the let him give, the giver. And this is the asker. Let's just say asker. Okay? So number one, let him ask. Okay? God is a God who fundamentally gives. This is who he is. If that's true, does this mean that we are fundamentally askers? Thought of that? I mean, I'm sure you've considered God as a giver. That's pretty clear in Scripture. He's labeled as a giver. You ever considered yourself as one who is fundamentally an asker?
I think that the biblical approach is for us to be fundamentally askers, but our nature is to be fundamentally needy.
Mm-hmm.
And we can approach that biblically by asking, or we can approach that through the perspective of man's fallen nature, which leads to all of the covetousness, envy, quarreling.
Yeah. So, what does your innate, culturally, worldly, trained instinct tell you about asking?
is superior.
Typically, we don't want to be askers, right? We want to get to a position in life where we aren't dependent on anybody. And this is one of the reasons it's been so difficult for me personally to get into this position where I'm comfortable raising finances for ministry. Because that requires me to do a whole lot of asking, and I hate asking. Okay. I mean, And I'm sure I'm not alone. I mean, you take pride in that point where you finally get into the position as a young person where you don't have to go to mom and dad to ask. You take comfort in the fact, you finally, get to a position in life, you don't have to ask the bank for a small loan to fix something on the house. Because you've got some set aside. You're self-sufficient. You don't want to have to ask. But here, the Bible, and not just here, but we are defined as ones who ask. Jesus said, ask and you will receive, right? We boldly approach the throne of grace to receive. It means we come to the throne of grace to ask. God, in His very nature, it is in His very nature to overflow, to beget existence, to give and to exude goodness. It is our very nature as products of God's exuberance, of God's effulgence. It is our very nature to be ones who are constantly receiving that from Him. We need to embrace our position as askers. Askers. Okay? But we have to ask in a certain way. With faith and without doubting. Okay? Now, we talked about faith. You guys know what faith is. Actually, James talks about faith in a number of different ways. One of them is the content of faith. Okay? The content of faith, what it is that we teach. He talks about it in the way that what it is that we believe. Doctrine, if you will. Okay? You believe that God is one, right? But here I think it's the subjective faith. It is the disposition of a heart towards God. It is, as we've defined it before, the belief that God can and will do what He's promised to do. Okay? If God is the one who gives, He is the giver, and He gives generously, without reproach, you come to God with all of your knowledge of your failures, of your lack of wisdom, of your foolishness, of your bad decisions, of your weaknesses, of your need, and you come to God and you say, oh God, I just don't know if you're going to give it to me. And, does that show a full understanding of who God is as a giver? Or can you come to Him and say, God, I know my weakness, I know my foolishness, but you promise to give, and you are the giver. Would you give this to me? Father, please give me wisdom. Knowing this wholeheartedly and confidently, being convinced that He will give because He's the giver. That's what faith is. Without reproaching yourself. I think that almost there's this almost chiastic kind of structure here where the without reproach kind of goes with faith. Because without reproach means, I think, if you're not holding against a person what you know to be true about them. And faith says, I'm clinging to what I know to be true about Him. Whereas this one generously has hidden in there this kind of underlying idea of wholeness, of singleness. We talked about this doubting word has this underlying idea of division and distinction. Okay? So we said this in Greek, it's this dia, you can just see H, diakrino. Okay, something like that. Diakrino, and so probably a K there, not a CH, but diakrino. So this word here is, again, to judge through or something like that. But it is this word that will be used in chapter 2 for making distinctions. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Okay, this word judge, this occurs twice there in James 2. The word occurs in either Romans or 1 Corinthians, I can't remember which context it is, about meats, making distinctions between foods, sacrificed to idols, I believe is the context there. So you're making distinction between one kind of food and another, between one kind of person and another. And then the word is used of a person subjectively of a person who has divisions within himself. Okay? By the way, this is one of those phrases that scholars believe mirrors what Jesus says about faith. Right? That when you ask, believe you received it without doubting. But this idea of having this distinction in yourself, this doubting, means that you're kind of wavering between two positions. You're not sure. You believe this over here, but you believe this over here. You're not sure which way to go. You're doubting whether this one is true or this one is true, whether this one this action should be taken or this action should be taken, whether he can be trusted or whether he can't be trusted. Okay? It's that picture of the division within a person. And so when you come to God, you have to come in faith, believing that he is who he is, and he gives the way he gives because of who he is. And you have to come to him without doubting. Now that can mean in relation to faith that you don't doubt whether God will give and God won't give. But I think it also implies this singleness. As God gives generously, as God gives singly, we have to come to him in a manner that reflects God's singleness as well. God's purity and generosity. We have to come as ones who are wholly dependent upon him, as he is wholly generous to us. And this is going to become the theme of James. The major theme of James. He's writing to people who say, I belong to the Christian community. I belong to the church. I am a New Testament believer, whatever language you want to use. And yet, their lives don't show it all the time. There are, and he goes through and he just kind of pokes holes in their bubble of belief to show them where they are not living and conducting their lives in this manner, in a position of being askers, receivers, people who are exercising faith and without this division of heart, of mind, of affection, of loyalty, of belief. He says the person who does ask without these things, the person who asks not having faith, the person who asks with a doubting heart, he says that person is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. This is not the ocean where you've got the waves coming in and then going out with the tide kind of thing. Some I've read suggest that this is more like the Sea of Galilee, where you can have the wind blowing from the northeast, and then you can have the wind blowing from the southeast, and you can have the wind blowing from the northwest, and it just all the time the waves are going, just different ways like this. Okay? And the picture is not so much that you have to understand that the different directions of the waves. The picture really is that you can never tell at one point or another how this person is going to be acting. Are you going to be acting on the principle of faith and trust in God, or are you going to be acting on the principle of doubt and fear? Are you going to be acting on the principle of commitment to the community of believers, or are you going to be acting out of the principle of self-interest and pride? Are you going to be acting out of love for God and self-sacrifice, or are you going to be acting out of envy and lust? Whatever else. So a person who is like this, who doesn't have these qualities, he just at any given time he may be operating out of one or the other or multiple different things. And he says that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. And again, since God gives to all, he's not saying that person should not expect and should not anticipate that God will ever give him anything ever. I mean, obviously God already has given him life and breath. God has given him the rain and the sun. God provides his food and his clothes. God provides a number of things. And we're assuming that this is a believer. God has provided community and salvation. But God's not going to give what he just asked. Because he did not ask rightly. That person should not suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Now this, I think, may be a little harsher. I mean, I don't want to blunt any of the edges of James's cutting remarks. He's very cutting. But I think this may be one that we hear as more cutting than it actually is. I think this is a descriptive term. We use it as a pejorative term. Double-minded, two-faced, split-tongued, whatever. Okay? James does use it to shame them later again, this double-minded. But here I think it may just be a descriptive term. He's double-minded because he's of two minds. He's got this diacrino. He's got this division in himself. And he's wavering back and forth between what he believes and what he's committed to and what he loves. He says that guy's unstable. He's unstable. And God is not going to honor that kind of commitment, non-commitment.
For me, unbiblical to talk about the difference between either having faith or not having it, or having it be a non-static thing to where it can, in this case, where it grows, and then as a Christian you have the ability to look back at what God has done, remember what God has done for you already, and then make it stronger. So that,
Yeah. So we know that faith is not, it's not, if you read James, it looks like it is. I mean, you've got this switch, and you've got faith, and you've got not faith, okay? And you're either on or you're off. I mean, that's what James seems like. You read Hebrews, and you see it's more like I'm getting artistic here, so you ought to be worried. It's more like a meter, where he says, you want to reach the full assurance of faith. Fill the meter all the way up. And so there is Paul mentions those who are of little faith. Jesus mentions those who are of little faith. So there's a difference between faith and non-faith, and weak faith and strong faith. Okay? So if we were to combine these two together, then you've got this on-off switch here, where you've got not faith and you've got faith. But once you move it over to the faith section, then you've got this volume button, knob, or amplitude, whatever. This looks very old, maybe like 80s, 70s, or 80s stereotype thing. Am I giving my age
I don't
away?
even know what you're talking about.
Am I giving my age away? Do I need to put an 8-track player in here? Anyway,
it's aircraft technology.
yeah. So the Bible does talk about you've got faith and you've got not faith. And not faith is always not faith, but when you have faith, you can have a very weak faith and a very strong faith. But weak faith is still faith. It's still genuine faith. I mean, Jesus talks about faith the size of a mustard seed, right? And the question is not so much. So the issue of, and this is probably reading more into James than we ought to, but I think the distinction is the object of that faith determines whether it's faith or not faith. The strength of conviction of God can and will determines the strength of faith, if that makes sense. So if you trust in God, but you don't feel very strong and confident that God would bless you, that's faith, I think, and because you're still fighting in that direction, but it's weak faith. But if you are saying, I trust in God this moment, and then say, oh, God can't do this, I better go get a second job. In that instance, that's not faith. Because you're now putting your trust in something other than God. Does that make sense? Or am I just muddying the waters? I may be muddying it. What are you trusting in? That's the object that faith attaches to. The object that you trust attaches to, that determines faith or non-faith. And then the strength of can he and will he inside that faith. When faith is directed at God, that the can he and will he, how confident you are in those, that would determine the strength.
I was just thinking in the case of looking back as a Christian, we have the ability to look back and see what he has already done.
And so that would strengthen your ability to say he can and he will, right? Because he's done it in the past. He's been faithful in the past. He's been good in the past. I mean, it's an expression of his character as the God who gives. Anyway, this should provide you material for a quiet time for multiple days, or weeks, or months. Because these kind of things, this is the kind of thing that you pray about. I mean, not just praying about getting wisdom, but praying that God would search your heart and show you, and mold you and shape you, and say, God, give me wisdom, but teach me to ask in faith. Teach me to ask you for wisdom and faith. Teach me to trust you. Teach me to believe you. Teach me to see you for who you are, as the God who gives, and who gives generously and without reproach. Teach me. Search my heart. Give me an undivided heart, David prays, to fear your name. Unite my heart to fear your name. Give me this, is it Soren Kierkegaard said, purity of heart is to will one thing. Give me the ability to will one thing. To live for you, to love you. There's a whole lot of meat here for prayer, and I can't digest it all for you. You got to go and chew on this. Verse 9, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flowers fall, or its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuit. There's a few difficulties here in these verses. The first part is pretty clear. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation. So again, we have this kind of parallelism, which is very common of wisdom literature as well. So we have the lowly in his exaltation, and we have the rich in his humiliation. Okay, so typically, socially, according to the world standards, we would think that these two go together and these two go together, right? The rich person, he's exalted. I mean, in society, that was true. With riches comes social status, comes social privilege, comes, possessions and honor and whatever. With lowliness comes humiliation. And now this. We probably are understanding this lowly to be financial and social stature, because being rich comes, brings this social status and stuff. But lowly just means it's a position. It's someone who is down low. So it could be they're poor, could be they're low social, very low on the social totem pole or social ladder, probably both. Okay? And Exaltation is an elevation term. It's the opposite of being low. One who is made high. And this is pretty much an equivalent of being brought low. One who is high being brought to a low position. Right? So, ironically, paradoxically, James says that the lowly person has been not humiliated, but exalted. And the rich has not been exalted, but he has been humiliated. Okay? Let him boast in his humiliation. So, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. Now, the word boast, you should know what this means. It means exactly what you think it means. To brag, okay? To celebrate in your status over the status of another person, kind of thing. Interestingly enough, the Bible never condemns boasting. We think boasting is a bit socially awkward, socially taboo. We shouldn't really do that. But the Bible doesn't condemn boasting, ever. It always emphasizes the appropriate object of boasting, however. If you boast in the wrong object, then your boasting is wrong. If you boast in your own pride, in your own strength, in your own wisdom, in your own riches, then your boasting is wrong and corrupt. If, however, you boast in the things you ought to boast in, boast in the Lord, boast in what He has done, boast in what He has given, then your boasting is good and right and glorifying to God. So the lowly brother, this is a Christian, again, brother, is to boast in his exaltation. What is his exaltation? This person who is low in social status, low in financial stability, people look down on him, but God has blessed him, has exalted him, and that lowly brother is to boast in the way that God has exalted him. And what is that exaltation?
He's righteous through Christ.
He's righteous through Christ. Okay. James doesn't say that, though.
Jeremiah 9:24 says, "Let him who boasts in this, that he understands and knows me."
He understands and knows me. Yeah. I think that's rooted, James is rooted in that. Look at verse, let's see, 2:5. Look at 1:12. Okay. So what is his exaltation? What about 4:6? Okay, so what is what is the exaltation of the lowly? According, just in light of those verses that we just read.
Reach in faith, heirs of the kingdom.
Yeah. He's exalted them to be heirs of the kingdom. That means, who is heir of a kingdom? A prince, right? How do you get more exalted than that? Okay. What about crown of life? placed a garland of victory upon your head and given you life. Okay? So a lot of this is in the world to come, but even in the world now, he's exalted them. Okay, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. God gives his grace. It's an experience of grace, an opportunity for grace when you're humiliated, when you're humble, when you're lowly. Right? It is also an opportunity of joy. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. And I think this is one of those trials we'll see in just a moment. So the lowly brother is exalted, and he's to boast in God's nearness and the things that God has promised him and God's provision for him. And yet the rich, and I think we have to supply the word brother here, the rich brother in his humiliation. So we're not boasting in the things that the world is telling us to boast about. And we're not to mourn over the things that the world tells us to mourn about. In normal circumstances, the lowly brother should mourn his situation. And James says, no, rejoice in that and boast in it. And the rich brother ought to be comforted and rejoice in how God has given him prosperity, right? And he says, no, don't boast in your riches, boast in how you are going to be humiliated. Huh? Okay. And then he draws on this scripture from Isaiah. And he says here, why is this rich man, this rich brother, why is he supposed to boast in his humiliation? It's because like a flower of grass, he or it, his riches, will pass away. For the sun rises, okay, that's common grace, that's God gives to all, with its scorching heat and withers the grass. The flower falls, its beauty perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. When you're pursuing your riches, you're going about doing your job, you're pursuing your career, you're climbing the social ladder, and while you're doing it, right in the middle of that, the sun will rise, will dry you out, and will disappear along with your riches. And so what do you have to boast in, rich man? If you're a brother or a sister, then and you're rich, and most of us are, even if you don't think you are, then you are to boast that all of that will be taken away. All of your riches will be gone. It will be taken away. And you boast in that. Why? Because it doesn't matter. Because when all of that is burned away and all of that's gone, there's something that remains. I think both of these situations, both being lowly and being rich, both of them constitute a trial, a perosmos, a temptation, if you will. Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, whether that's lowliness or riches. And then this, in the ESV, puts verse 12 with what comes after. I take it with what comes before, because he speaks of trials again here. He says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Count it all joy when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Steadfastness. In the face of the trials that lowliness brings, and in the face of the trials that riches bring. And he's going to talk a lot about those. Steadfastness. There is a reward at the end when your faith has been tested and tried and proven genuine. And that reward is life. The crown, which is life. That God has promised, the God who gives, has promised to those who love him. Now let's not miss this. There is, I think, another echo there to what we've talked about from the first, and that is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. We miss it a lot, but in the New Testament, if you go through and you look about how we are to love God, there's this little phrase that most of the time goes along with this concept of loving God, and it's the idea of keeping His commands. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Love God, love neighbor, go hand in hand. And these things fulfill the whole law. And for James, this is central to his argument. God has promised us life. We are to persevere through trial in light of our understanding of reality and relationship with God as we keep His commandments and love Him. Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Next week I shall not be here, though I should not say that because then nobody shows up. The lovely bearded man over here will be teaching.